Welcome, Kevin Jones, convener of SOCAP.
Yes.
So 9 years over SOCAP now.
Yeah.
What's your reflection?
Well, one of the things that was probably most interesting this year was one of the people who's been here half a dozen years has a kind of a large, what we now call impact investing vehicle. Reminded me that before we started, I started talking about there's a need for this new conference a year and a half before we started. So it was really 10 and a half years ago. He was one of the first to tell me there was no need for this. I was the wrong guy. It was the wrong idea, and my execution plan was wrong. And, you know, he's been an attendee, paying attendee for 6 years, and he's just wanted to remind me that, you know, I was one of the first to tell you you were wrong. That this is not needed. So it turns out that this was needed. We needed a market that was motivated like philanthropy to do good, to be what the world needs, what you would give to the social part of the capital market or the social capital part. But we also wanted to add the market part, that investing in business has to take its place along with philanthropy, along with the public sector, the civic sector, in doing good. That the problems of the world are too big for government and philanthropy to solve. We are facing climate change. We're facing the deep risk of wealth disparity, where immigrants are suddenly disrupting cultures that were doing fine beforehand, but they can't bear this cost. And so business is the best way to allocate resources, better than philanthropy and better than government. And so it needs to take its place to build the economy and the world that we need. And that's now happened.
Yeah. And you feel, is it any specific things that you think about this 9 years that has surprised you?
I think we really have changed the narrative in a way that I've been surprised about. I'm surprised how much of the way people think has changed. 9 years ago, we were going against the dominant myth of capital, which is that I invest for a financial return, and I don't have to care about what happens as a result of the money I put in. I just have to think about how much money I get back and how fast I get back, at what kind I margin. And now people realize that, you know, we can't live in a world like that. There are such things as planetary boundaries, as the Stockholm Resilience Center says, and that we have to live within that. And that business is now realizing it has to play its part, and the market has to be tamed. I think the idea that we have to tame the market in the face of climate change and in the face of the social disruption from wealth disparity is really much more broadly accepted. Now, we played a part in that, but we're only one part of that.
But this year you also have a new theme. You had an extra day on neighborhood economics. Why?
We did. Well, because SOCAP was really created in a way to validate the role of venture capital in doing good. So that's risk capital that you don't pay back, but you pay, it pays off when it wins, in the role of doing good. And that was the first kind of change of the way of thinking. And it does that, and that's a global thing. But then when you look at many places, venture capital doesn't work. Right? You need a circle of angels who are ready to circle around these startups and add their own money until they get to institutional funding. And you need startups that are ready for equity as opposed to debt, as opposed to grants, all those kinds of things. And many places, venture capital just doesn't work. There's not a pipeline of companies that want venture capital. So we're looking at where venture capital doesn't work, all the other places that are most of the places. You know, venture capital is, it can work in Copenhagen, it can work in Stockholm, it can work in Malmö some, it can work in Gothenburg some, but it can't work over most of Sweden. Most of Sweden needs things where collective ownership is what you have to think about things, and co-ops and things. And so when you do that, venture capital suddenly becomes a subservient force rather than the dominant force. And so the civic sector matters, nonprofits matter, activists matters, and businesses that are not going to exit, but then they're going to create local wealth matters. So it's a holistic ecosystem that you have to realize how you fit in. Venture capital doesn't have to do that. Venture capital's metric is internal rate of return. It just means how much money did you get out, how fast. So it's a different discussion. So we're going to divorce that discussion and create a national local economy conference. We think probably in Baltimore, because it's one of our most broken cities in the United States, but it's also one of the ones that's broken enough that so many new things are happening. There's community-owned solar in a new way involved in it. It's broken so much that they're ready to try a lot of things that are new.
But when we look at the financing sector, and it seems to be that it's more defined that they have a big role to play.
Yes.
But it's still a very big gap between the promises and demands in the cities.
Yeah, yeah.
And do you think that SOCAP can play a role on to minimize the gap between the financing sector and what's going to happen in the neighborhoods?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there was this crazy thing that happened that the whole world bought into. It happened in 1905 in the U.S., where we set up our nonprofit sector, and we said the market is a force of nature, and therefore it doesn't have to deal with its externalities, all the things that it causes. And we set up nonprofits to deal with the problems that business causes. That whole equation no longer worked. That equation was set up by the robber barons, by Rockefeller, by Carnegie, by the robber barons, to make sure that the market could be seen as a force of nature, as opposed to an idea that we made up to serve us. And so I think, the market has to be reduced in its role, and the financial markets have to be reduced to serving us. And so I think we can do that better on a local basis. If you deal with it as an abstract asset class, people are afraid of what they're giving up. Oh, I'm giving up some financial return. If you deal with it in your local community, I'm investing in my local community, and I'll bear some cost. I will tax myself for some return to create the community that will cause my children and grandchildren to want to live here after I die.
So when we look at the 10th year of SOCAP,
we're in the 9th year, so the next year is 10th year.
Yeah.
So
what do you think you're going to focus on?
I think we're going to look at more marginalized communities. We're going to look at what's happening with African Americans in the U.S. We're looking at what's happening with indigenous people around the world. We'll look at what's happening with, we have an economy that's working for a lot of people, but not working for all people. So I think this whole focus of, capital as a force for good now has to look at who's getting that good. I mean, in what way are we creating community wealth, and in what way are we creating inclusive wealth? In what way are we creating wealth for every neighborhood? In what way in Gothenburg are we creating wealth for Barahone? Barahone is isolated. In what way are we reaching the isolated communities everywhere to create wealth in places that we may not go to?
As a selfish question to you, what do you see in the Nordic welfare system that could bring values to the discussion at SOCAP?
Oh my goodness, you guys realize the problem and you solve it, whereas we as Americans fight, and we have the activists fight the business people. I don't think we would have ever cleaned up the lake. What is the name of it? The Great Lake outside Lidköping, the lake there. When I first experienced the Nordic experience, there'd been realization that the lake was so dirty you couldn't drink out of it, and it was caused by industry at the north end. And it wasn't industry fighting government, fighting activists. It was collectively you realized the problem and you solved it. And now the folks at the on the east side are competing with the folks on the west side to see how many value-added fish and other aquatic products you can get out of a clean lake. The Nordic way to solve the problem, realize the problem collectively and solve it and not fight, is something all the rest of us need to know.
Oh, maybe then we could see you up in the Impact Journey activity on the next year in Vålerim and Luleå.
I've wanted to go to Vålerim. So, Vålerim is a role model for all of us, I think. I mean, they only survive by working together. There's so much to learn from a place like that.
Yeah. So hope to see you in Sweden next year. Thanks.
That'd be great. Thank you so much, Guy.
Thanks.
Okay.